What's cracking, y'all? You are now watching Boo TV. Appreciate you for stopping in. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, stay notified, and let's get into the topic for today. What's cracking, y'all? Back with another reaction video from the YouTube channel Thinking Basketball, a great YouTube channel. We've done stuff from here before. Definitely go check this channel out. All sorts of just amazing videos on a vast array of players and topics. So this one was recommended to us from Mick and Nee, so appreciate you, Mick and Nee. I hope I didn't mess up your name, but this subscriber definitely wanted me to check this video out, and some other ones about the highest peaks that I haven't reacted to yet, including Shaquille O'Neal and Reggie Miller. So I'll definitely make sure I get to those as well. I appreciate you and your support, and helping me push more content out. So thank you. This one, how the NBA continues to make scoring easier. Well, that is not a lie. I've been on this channel for ever since I started this channel, and before I started this channel, talking about how much easier it is to score in today's NBA for everyone, especially for so many different reasons. And that's why when I look at the scoring output of teams and even individual players, I don't make a direct one-to-one comparison to what players were doing, say, mid-2000s and prior. I gotta look at the era, I gotta look at the pace, I gotta look at the rules, I gotta look at the defenses, I gotta look at all the stuff and be like, okay, given this information, this is the conclusion I came to. This era was easier to score in for these players or these positions or whatever, and this one the opposite. And now if I think I take this player and his skill set, this is what he was able to do with these limitations, put him in today's era, yeah, his output would be even more than what we've seen in his previous era. These are the type of conclusions I come to. But that's how I look at it. People don't really look at it that way. Context is key. Numbers give you a value. It's up to you to determine why that value is what it is. What's its genetic makeup? How did this come to be? Why is this value, this number, telling this story? What is the story behind it? But that's how I look at it. And I'm not going to get into, because like I said, I've preached about it. The rule changes, pace, the era, the players, the systems, everything before. But this is a 30-minute video, so I'm curious to see what Thinking Basketball has to say about it and how they are going to present it. Because these guys are so creative and they're so smart, and they'll usually think of things and find angles that I didn't even consider or think about. So I'm very interested in getting into this one. So it's about 30 minutes long. Sit back, relax. Let's get into it.
Men in green, the Milwaukee Bucks. That's Alcindor against Bellamy. No basket, says Richie Powell. It's an offensive foul. He moved into it.
Yes, you heard that correctly. Back in 1970, this was an offensive foul for leaning into the defender. A few decades later, a more aggressive version of the very same play had become a defensive foul. How did we go from punishing the offense for initiating contact to rewarding it? Why was this play called a travel back in 1990 on Charles Barkley? But in last year's playoffs, this Al Horford hop, skip, and a jump netted 2 points without a whistle. And how, in the name of basketball, have we somehow ended up with plays like this leading to free throws for the offense? A number of major rule changes have helped the NBA evolve. The implementation of the shot clock sped up the sport. The widening of the lane stopped big men from camping out under the basket. And of course, the three-point shot led to today's pace and space revolution. League-wide offensive efficiency steadily improved in the 1960s and 70s until the implementation of the three-point line in 1980, where efficiency leveled off for about 2 decades before defenses pushed it back down at the turn of the century. We'll talk about why in a second. In the 2000s, offenses improved again, and in the last 5 years, we've seen an offensive explosion. These changes are often credited to strategic improvements like cutting out long two-point shots or an expansion of the talent pool that now features more international stars. But the rules, and sometimes just the enforcement of rules, has morphed in a way that makes life easier for the offense. Take something as basic as dribbling. We probably take it for granted today, but ball handling rules were more strictly enforced in the earlier days of the league, which made it impossible to dribble the way most players do now. Originally, they were supposed to dribble with their hand on top of the ball, and they couldn't let the ball sit up and rest in their palm, which slowed down or paused the dribble. Versions of these limitations are still in the official rulebook today, although the language now allows a player to put his hand under the rock as long as he doesn't carry it. Here's a slick in and out crossover from 1973. Notice the right hand facing down, and then the left hand comes under the ball on the last dribble, and that's a carrying violation. Here's another carry from 1978, where Julius Erving seems to just fumble the ball, but those were stricter times. Since pausing and cupping the ball is easier, players have been pushing the boundaries for decades. Here, the hand is just slightly on the side of the ball with a minor wrist turn, and Erving gets away with a similar technique, turning the ball from its side before detonating on some redhead. By the 80s, this slight cupping and rotating of the wrist was no longer called a violation. That meant the hand could sneak lower and even under the ball occasionally for better control, which meant that players could sometimes carry it without a whistle, in this case pushing the ball mid-flight to execute the crossover. By the end of the 80s, the best dribblers were able to get underneath and turn the ball like this for maximum control, and so normal dribbling in the 90s involved more of this turning and controlling of the ball, sometimes even cupping it. With the hand underneath it, players could pause the dribble a little more. Chauncey Billups actually scoops the ball upwards after restarting his dribble, then pauses it on the hesitation before carrying it across his body with the crossover, which would have been a whistle in prior era.
Listen, what Chauncey Billups just did would have been like 4 violations. 3 or 4.
Additional cupping and pushing has been normalized in recent years, and now most players dribble with their hand underneath the ball to turn it and control it, and those plays are becoming more common without being called for a violation. So we've gone from this to this in about half a century without the...
Sorry, I'm going to be pausing to get my thoughts across. I know some people can't stand it, but I can't make everybody happy. If I wait to the end of the video, I'm going to forget what I got to say, and I don't want to be sitting here writing things down to jog my memory. So bear with me. I appreciate you. And you see why us old heads, even people more old head than I am, when they deal with people constantly saying prior errors weren't skilled, look at how they dribble, And you see why the old heads keep saying, bro, we weren't allowed to carry the ball and do all this crazy stuff that the players are doing today. That stuff wasn't allowed back then. You get called for a violation. That's a turnover. But don't act like they couldn't violate rules. They weren't allowed to because it was a violation. I've seen people like Pistol Pete, even people like Danny Ainge, like practicing off the court, like literally practice, seeing them do all these types of tricks and things they couldn't do in games. And I'm like, damn, Danny Ainge actually got some serious handles, but he just can't do the things that the players are allowed to do now. I digress.
The actual rules really changing. Many of these dribbles are in violation of the rule book, but in effect, they're legal today because the whistle is never blown. This has also happened with traveling, where players used to be held to 2 strict steps after releasing their last dribble. But today things are a little different. In the 70s, there were traveling calls that don't look like travels anymore.
That ain't a travel.
They were so militant about travels that even in slow motion, it's hard to see them.
By today's standards, that's definitely not a travel.
Magic Johnson's right foot takes a step, then his left, then I guess his right moves 3 inches.
Oh, God.
And I think the replay officials at the time would have said it was the right call. Here's a play from 1972 that isn't a travel under any interpretation, but it was called nonetheless. And even in the 80s, certain spin moves were endangered of being whistled for a walk.
Yes.
The earliest full-on Euro step I found was from 1982, and that long, decelerated stride was instantly called illegal. And many of these plays were whistled because there was no gather step back then.
With
The
that left
count
hand.
used to start on the last dribble, so at best this was 1, 2, 3 steps and a turnover. Scottie Pippen got away with the gather
Even though his pivot foot was planted.
step a ton in the 90s, but it still wasn't honored in many situations. This would never be called a travel today, but in 1996, it was too many dance steps on the last dribble. Fast forward 10 or 15 years, when the gather was unofficially accepted, and this Manu Ginobili sorcery was viewed as a legal 2-step play instead of a 4-step travel.
Ginobili was nasty.
In 2019, the NBA officially added the gather step to the rulebook, paving the road for all kinds of step-back moves.
Now you see what James Harden just did. This guy would do that. I'm not joking with you. That step back right there, James Harden was doing that shit like 20 times a game, if not more. He does the same. If he's shooting a jump shot, it is the same move every time. Step back 3. Walk backwards 3, or he's just going to the lane for layups. That was James Harden's game. That was his bread and butter, something that would have gotten called a travel every time. Now, James Harden, how else can you score now that your main bread and butter has been taken away from you? This is the kind of stuff I'm talking about, people. So, stop tearing down these past eras, man. Understand the context. Preach on, thinking basketball.
Moves and new age balletic Euros that would have been illegal in the olden times. Modern players have way more leeway starting their dribble as well.
They can take several
steps. Back in the day, you couldn't lift your pivot foot before releasing the ball, although this has been inconsistently called forever, and you certainly couldn't just jog and plan a move after receiving a pass. This led to some incredible travels, like this 0-step shot without a dribble, and this half-step travel by Henry Bibby in the 1977 finals. If you bobbled the ball, forget about it. That was an immediate travel for a number of years.
Now it's considered you just don't have control over the basketball, so you can bobble it all the way down the court as long as you've shown not to have control.
Even in the 80s, remnants of the illegal bobble travel can be found before the refs realized that to travel, it might make sense for the player to successfully possess the ball in the first place. Here's a hesitation on the catch from 1963. But that little pause draws a traveling call, whereas today we see players set up shots with multiple steps without ever starting a dribble. This is a nice perk for today's offensive attackers who don't have to worry about dribbling instantly when they catch the ball. These looser and looser interpretations of ball handling tactics not only help offensive players, but they make the missed calls even more extreme, sometimes leading to 3-step or even 4-step travels without a whistle being blown. The loose interpretations don't stop there, though. The entire concept of in the act of shooting has expanded a ton over the years.
Oh, yeah.
On this post-up, Bill Walton is fouled as he's turning into his shot, but it's 1977, so sometimes this was a non-shooting foul. In the 90s, these plays could go either way. Scottie Pippen's bumped here, and he instinctively launches it at the basket and is rewarded with free throws. Yet, in the very next game, Clyde Drexler's hit as he's about to jump, and it's called a foul on the floor. Today's players are given an extremely liberal definition of in the act of shooting, where they feel some contact on the perimeter and then flail the shot toward the basket and are being rewarded with free throws. Ironically, the league put out a video in 2017 explaining exactly what constitutes in the act, declaring that on drives in this area, the act of shooting starts after the gather, and on outside shots, it starts on the upward shooting motion. Even with that, players are repeatedly fouled on the floor and then receive free throws for gathering and shooting after that contact. In essence, these calls take what used to be a side out of bounds and replace it with an 80% shot. So, without changing many rules, interpreting them differently over the years has been a huge boon for offenses, and we haven't even touched, arguably, the single biggest interpretation change of them all. Some quirky old NBA rules that are wild to look back on, like awarding 3 free throws in order to make 2 on shooting fouls in the bonus. Before 1970, putbacks off missed free throws only counted as a single point, and that point went to the free throw shooter, not the rebounder.
I didn't know that.
And, among other oddities, pinning the ball against the backboard was actually goaltending for some period of time. I have no idea when this stopped, but it apparently didn't fly back at the beginning of the 70s.
And watch him pin it off the backboard, which is illegal.
Perhaps the biggest shift of all is how physical contact has been officiated, and specifically who has been rewarded or punished for initiating contact. This is an offensive foul because the attacker lowers his shoulder into the defender, even if there isn't a ton of contact.
You better show all those LeBron James highlights where this guy, for his entire career, has been lowering his shoulder and bulldozing people, not getting called with the offensive foul, but they getting called for the defensive foul. And this guy has made a career out of barreling his shoulder through people.
In the 60s and 70s, offensive players didn't even have to make contact. Just the act of leaning in or jumping into a defender could draw an offensive foul. That meant it was common for offensive fouls to be called when defenders slid in front of the ball without falling over. Today, this would be a no call, but in 1971, Walt Hazzard was whistled for dipping his shoulder into the defender who beat him to the spot. It didn't matter if the defender kept moving or even jumped. There was simply little tolerance for the offense jumping into defenders and initiating contact. This might not look like a defensive foul, but that's because there was less physicality in general during that era. Defenders would armbar and hand check, but the slightest nudge or bump could be called a foul. The 60s has this reputation for being tough and rugged, but there wasn't much contact allowed in space and with the ball. By the 80s, hand fighting and physical contact was more commonly allowed on drives like this, and in the 90s they let plenty go as well. That's a solid push to the shoulder that goes uncalled there. Physicality probably peaked in the early 2000s, where there was a ton of contact away from the ball at times, and some of these contests felt...
And this is when the NBA really started loosening up on the rules after this, those mid-2000s, because the pace was slow, the scoring was slow, they didn't like the product because it was so physical, there's so much defense, and then that's when things started going to shit, in my opinion. So when I see players like Kobe, Iverson, McGrady, Vince, these kind of guys pop off as elite scorers in this era, I'm like, yeah, they different.
Like rugby matches instead of a basketball game. There was plenty of contact allowed on the ball as well. After this ruggedness ground scoring to a halt, the league made a concerted effort to give perimeter players more freedom of movement. But in most areas, the game is still far more physical than it was in the 60s and 70s. This kind of hand fighting probably wouldn't be permitted back then, and there was no foul at the end of this play despite contact. So, because...
Now, this is a playoff game, so they usually do let more physicality, they allow more physicality in the playoffs as opposed to the regular season. So I have to point that out. This clip here, they probably would have called that in the regular season, but it's the playoffs, so they let them play a little bit. If you notice, a lot of the games in the playoffs, Notice how much of a scoring dip there is opposed to the regular season. Wonder why that is.
Because there was less contact in general, especially out in space on drives like this, initiating contact was frequently whistled as a foul on the offense. This started to balance out a little more in the 80s as the game became more physical. A little lean in by Isaiah Thomas was a defensive foul here, but in the very same half, this little bump on a post-up was called on the offense. The physicality of the 80s was famously on display in the classic wars between the Celtics and Lakers, Celtics and Pistons, and really the Celtics and anyone. But by the middle of the decade, leaning in like this could still be called on the offense like it was here. It could be a no call like this Isaiah lean in. Note the defender thought he was the one fouled. And those little shoulder drops could even be defensive fouls if the angles weren't so clear cut. By the 2000s, it was common for these plays to be non-calls, and by 2010, we started to see the defense regularly called for fouls when the offense barreled into them. That prompted this prescient quote from Jeff Van Gundy during the 2008 playoffs.
When the offense is allowed more contact than the defense, it's wrong. It's like if you're in a legal guarding position, if the offense brings it into you, it's no call or an offensive foul.
In recent years, fouls are now regularly called on the defense after the offense initiates that contact. This happens a lot on drives, dropping a shoulder into the defender to create contact, and often earn the offense free throw.
I can't speak for past eras, but something that happens a lot in this era that pisses me off is when the offensive player, they go whatever, do a move, contact or no contact, whatever, the referee will wait to see if the basket goes in or not before they decide to blow the whistle. That is horrible refereeing, and that happens, I swear to you, almost every single game I watch. It's like, you blowing the whistle should not be predicated on if the basket goes in or not.
Rose. Sometimes this comes in the form of veering back into the defender, running alongside the ball handler, although the league made it a point of emphasis to call these offensive fouls in 2022. But there were no shortage of defensive fouls this year for offensive players leaning in while running alongside defenders. Another popular way to create contact is up faking and then jumping into defenders. Again, the league made it a point to revert these back to being called offensive fouls in 2022 because shooters were essentially throwing defenders off balance and then launching themselves into them like they had a bullseye on their chest.
I still see that getting called defensive fouls a lot, to be honest. I ain't even lying. Because I'm like, I thought that was supposed to be an offensive foul now.
Even after those points of emphasis, we still saw a ton of plays where the offense hurled itself into the defense and then earned free throws.
See?
And dribblers can still target a moving defender in space and bounce into him and head to the charity stripe. Compared to prior decades, this is still a massive philosophical shift, where the offense is rewarded for dropping the shoulder into the chest of the defender. A play like this probably is an offensive foul in the 1980s when Joel Embiid drops his shoulder and then discards the defender with the off arm, and there might have been a second foul dipping into his chest, but Grant Williams is so freakishly strong that he just holds his ground, and in today's game, this is called a defensive foul. Using that off arm on the defender is a major part of this story. Devin Booker karate chops the defender's arm out of the way here before driving into him for a foul. But this used to be called an offensive foul. Watch the swipe with the left hand here that's called on the ball handler. Officials were incredibly quick to whistle offensive fouls on any advantage with that off arm. Phil Jackson's right arm was called for clearing space on this hook shot, and even just briefly extending an arm to hold off a defender could be called an offensive foul in the 1970s. In the 80s and even 90s, officials were still on the lookout for off-arm techniques, but at some point in the 2000s, as more physicality was allowed, offensive players could do more with their off arm without having it called. Watch Steve Nash's right arm keep the defender at bay here, and instead of a foul, it's a layup. By 2022, the scales had tipped enough for this play to be called a defensive foul on the defender's face.
I love Giannis.
And no, there was no whistle on that little body bump beforehand. And yes, this call was upheld on replay. Compare that to Milwaukee's other MVP, who was immediately whistled for an offensive foul on an almost identical play a half century earlier. Today, little shoves and whatnot are frequently let go, whereas in the 90s, it was more common to see an off-arm foul called on the ball handler. Again, offensive players today are initiating this contact and using it to create space. There's no call on this one, although officials are definitely calling some of these backhanded shoves offensive fouls as well. James Harden, in particular, uses a bent off arm to drive into defenders and create space, and he almost never straightens the arm when extending and pushing away from defenders. That serves as a kind of shield, again, initiating the contact and sometimes pushing off. Here's a great view of the technique where he's delivering a blow with the bent arm, and this one was actually called on Harden.
Thank God.
But most of the time, keeping the arm bent and pushing the defender is uncalled, which brings us to the most extreme version of initiating contact the sport has ever seen, and the 86-foot jump shot. Some elements of the 80s and 90s are probably never coming back. Long twos don't make much sense anymore. Many teams created space through the illegal defense rules. We'll discuss that in another video. And there was a brutality to the era that has been washed out of today's game. No suspension.
I disagree on long twos, just because of not even looking at it from a point value, right? That in between doesn't give you three, and it isn't as easy as a layup. But having that as your weapon to be effective in that mid range opens up more opportunities on the outside and the inside, because now the defense has to worry about that mid-range threat. See, that's how I look at it, man. It creates gaps in the defense. But it is what it is.
Were handed out here. Back in the 80s, hard and dirty in-game fouls weren't always called flagrant. This one was a common foul, and this famous incident in the 1987 Eastern Finals wasn't even a foul, just nothing, although Robert Parrish was suspended for a game. By the early 90s, the league had cracked down on fighting and overtly dangerous fouls. This one was an ejection, and in the very next game, this was called a flagrant. But there was a ton of physicality from possession to possession, especially...
I was about to say that. It's like they were still cracked down on all you want, but it was still physical and they were still doing it. Just sometimes they were paying the penalty for it.
Especially down in the post.
Look at that.
This kind of wrestling for position and hand fighting wasn't really part of the game before the three-point line. Watch Kareem move through the lane here. That little bump was called a defensive foul. That's all it took. And there just simply wasn't a ton of jostling or powerful seals in the 60s and 70s off the ball. It was common to see post-ups from players where defenders gave them space instead of leaning on them or driving them off their spots. In the mid-70s, there might be a forearm to the back to keep an offensive player stationary, but they weren't leaning all their weight into each other in a battle for paint position like we'd seen in later decades. Listen to the broadcasters marvel at how physical Walt Bellamy is back in Abdul-Jabbar's first game.
Bellamy really working him over away from the ball now. He's leaning on him, hitting him with the elbow around the waist. Look at that elbow.
There you see the elbow on his wrist here. Look at how Bellamy using that weight.
Wilt Chamberlain was actually called for an offensive foul for backing down here. But in the 90s and 2000s, the power back down was a staple for the strongest players in the sport, like Shaquille O'Neal. Methodically backing down defenders.
That's, everybody would always say when they try to pull Wilt down, oh, he was bigger than everybody did. All he used to do was sit there and dunk back people down. It's like, no, actually, Wilt wasn't allowed to do that. Imagine if Wilt was allowed to do that, to use his size in that manner.
was so common that in 2000 the league added a 5-second count, making it a violation to back down defenders for longer than that. So if you're wondering how the 90s and 2000s featured a bunch of giant, stiff big men who couldn't shoot or dribble, it's partly because there was a ton of contact allowed down in the trenches, and size and strength were really important for winning the battle down there. But something you didn't see in any of these positional battles was flopping. This 1993 post-up was an offensive foul, and the defender doesn't even fall down to draw the whistle. There were a few
God, I can't stand all the damn flopping today. So, how about just play defense? Play good defense. Play sturdy defense. It's damn flopping, man. Oh, you can sit here and the NBA can try to tell me this is a better product, a more watchable product. Yeah, to a complete casual. No, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see acting. I don't want to watch the WWE, WWF, whatever it's called, WCW. I don't even know what that stuff is called now. Come on, man. If I want to see acting, I'll go watch something like that. Play defense. What was damn acting? Ugh.
Actors who certainly accentuated contact at that point in time, but falling down wasn't really a tactic, and most players just kept on playing through the physicality, which is slightly different than how things are today. Flopping really started to take off in the 2000s, where players would yell and flail in order to accentuate a possible foul, and that ushered in foul-baiting techniques like the head snap to draw attention to even the slightest contact. All that has snowballed to where we are today, with players constantly trying to trick the officials into calling fouls that don't exist. This manipulation has manifested itself in a number of ways. For instance, constantly falling down after shooting to draw fouls, when there's no reason to be falling down other than to draw phantom fouls. The fall down is a cousin of the leg kick, where a shooter splays his legs out to contact a defender, so yes, the defender can be called for a foul. The earliest leg kick I've seen was from Doug Collins in 1978, but its popularity has taken off in the last few seasons, and combined with the fall down, has earned countless free throws for shooters at the expense of helpless defenders. In 2022, the league said these leg kicks would now be offensive fouls because, the offensive player is doing the kicking, but players still tried this technique in the season, and some even still argued with officials after they were no longer called on the defense. One reason players are falling like rocks is the landing space foul, which was magnified after Kawhi Leonard's ankle injury in the 2017 Western Finals. Older versions of this actually required banging into a shooter with the body, while sliding under a shooter's feet without any other contact was almost never called a foul during the 20th century. Still, of all the tricks to draw fouls, the so-called rip-through might be the most mind-boggling. Tim Duncan had a more primitive rip-through, whipping his arms up into the defender, knowing he would draw contact and free throws. And Kobe Bryant was one of the first players to overtly use the technique. Notice how he targets the defender's arm instead of rising up in his normal motion. The rip-through epitomizes this philosophical shift that rewards offensive players for initiating the contact instead of punishing them. The entire idea behind the move is that instead of trying to shoot, the offensive player tries to swing his arms into the defender's often stationary arm. And at this point, the arm can really be anywhere. This play was a defensive foul. Trae Young feels the defender getting close, so he just rips and flails to draw a call. This was actually turned into a non-call on review, and in a Hall of Fame level sequence, Joel Embiid tries the rip through multiple times and ends up throwing the ball off the defender. All this ripping through has spawned the off-arm hook, where the offensive player hooks the defender's arm instead of gathering the ball in a natural motion. And again, this was being called a defensive foul until 2022, although this year we still saw some of the most incredible fouls in league history. Harden trips and rips into the defender while falling over, and ladies and gentlemen, that earned him 2 free throws. To say we've come a long way from the days where this was called an offensive foul feels like an understatement. Players are now playing with their hands literally clasped behind their back to take away the target of the rip-through. If we look at shooting fouls per 100 two-point shot attempts, we see a big jump in 2005 when the league relaxed contact on the perimeter, and then a fairly steady ratio until the 2020 season when shooting fouls spiked in the bubble and have remained incredibly high. Meanwhile, the dribbling and traveling changes have helped suppress turnovers. Yes, strategy and skill development play a role in this entire story, but the rules also make it easier to maintain possession now compared to the 80s or the 60s. It was far more common then to see teams apply pressure to force shaky ball handlers into turnovers, and one easy way to help dribblers in those spots is by setting a screen. Screens originally had to be set well before the defender arrived. That last-second hop was a moving screen, and even though this screen was set, the little turn was enough to draw a moving screen call in the 1970s. In the 90s, screeners started to use their arms more and lean into defenders, and that evolved into something akin to blocking for the quarterback. Karl Malone pushes and then slides with the defender here, helping John Stockton send the Jazz to the 97 finals. In the 80s, it was hard to get away with flipping a screen on top of the defender like this without giving him space, and you couldn't just slide into a defender's path at the last second without drawing a call. By the 2000s, it was far more common for screeners to kind of move through a defender's path while rolling, and players could have way more movement on their screens without being fully set. Today, you're supposed to give a defender the chance to change directions, but blocking tactics like this are rarely called on the screener.
Yeah, that's
the
true.
big advantages screeners have now is they can often move into players' bodies to pick them like this instead of waiting for them in their path.
Right.
They can move at the last second, sometimes repeatedly, to flip or reset a screen that originally won't connect. And they can even get away with turning and driving through players like an NFL lineman. A huge number of screens in any given game now would have been illegal in 1972, and the same can be said for many other types of plays. A play like this in a prior era could have been called a travel, then an offensive foul for pushing off, then a travel for shuffling the feet, then an offensive foul for jumping into the defender. This play could have stopped with an illegal dribble, then maybe an offensive foul for leaning in, possibly a travel, and continuation wouldn't have been awarded by a number of old officials. The big takeaway here, at least for me, is that the game has evolved and continues to evolve even when changes aren't formally made to the rule book. Some of these changes have made the game far more entertaining, and for my money, some have gone too far to cripple defenders and reward players for manipulating refs. So, yes, strategy and training tactics have improved, the talent pool is deeper than ever, but the way the game is officiated also plays a big part in this story, and it's one reason why we're living in the friendliest offensive environment the NBA has ever seen. To support this channel, check out patreon.com/thinkingbasketball. We have additional content, a ton of historical stats, and a Discord community that is well-versed in league history. A huge thanks to everyone for watching this one all the way through. It was a bit different, so I hope you found it valuable. And as always, I really hope you're having a great day.
Beautifully laid out and very informational from Thinking Basketball. My oh my, have times changed. And there were a couple things from each of the eras where it made it easier for them, but nowadays there is an overwhelming amount of changes and rules and ignorance that just makes it just so much easier. And this was by design. It was all by design, because at the end of the day, it's entertainment, and they want to put out an entertaining product that encourages and allows for more scoring and players to score easier, to set up their shots easier, to run offense easier. All those things that used to be illegal violations that slowed the game down or made it more difficult or caused turnovers, we don't want that anymore. We want this to be an open sandbox of offensive creativity. Go out and do what you want to do. I don't play Minecraft, but I'm a little bit familiar with it. And it is like playing Minecraft on God mode. Just do whatever the hell you want to do in your sandbox. That is the current NBA, and that's why I make sure when I evaluate and try to compare players from past eras, and I know some people hate doing it. They're like, oh, just let this era be that era. Stop trying to compare them. It's barbershop talk. People like to talk about it. Hell, even I like to talk about it. Guilty. But if I'm going to do it, I'm going to apply the context based on the information and knowledge I know about these players in that era, and these systems, and these rules, and these violations. What's going to get your hand slapped? What's not going to get your hand slapped? And then I have to take that into consideration. It's a whole lot of computing that goes on when I come to my conclusions. And sometimes I can look back on my old content and be like, I think I was wrong there. I think maybe I didn't get my point across the way I wanted to. Maybe I was wrong. I admit that happens sometimes. I'd be saying lying if I said all my points are valid and strong. I do my best, but I am far from perfect and not always right. You know. Anyway, again, I appreciate you, fam, for the recommendation, and I'll be sure to check out those other ones about the highest peaks. Check out the Shaq and Reggie Miller video. Hopefully not too far in the distant future, all right? Appreciate y'all for stepping in. Let me know what you think about it. Chime in, old heads and new heads alike, and I catch you on the next one. We out, baby.